On a cool fall morning in October of 2000, 27-year-old Maureen Ryan was out for her daily jog. The air felt crisp in her lungs as she kept a brisk pace along the waters of Cape Cod in Massachusetts. Until recently, she had been working as a rock climbing instructor out west, so as a result, Maureen was in great shape and very fit. She had always been athletic though, rowing crew and playing lacrosse and field hockey back during her high school days in Pittsburgh. But today, halfway through her very routine run, she suddenly felt woozy, and a surge of nausea crept up from her stomach. Maureen slowed to a walk and tried some rhythmic breathing to try to steady her heart rate. Unfortunately, it didn't help. She got dizzier and more lightheaded until it felt like the ground was tilting, and then suddenly it was rushing up at her. The next time she opened her eyes, Maureen was face down on the jogging path, her cheek pressed flat against the cold concrete. Her head absolutely throbbed. She rolled onto her side and began rubbing the bruise on her skull. Maureen felt lucky she hadn't knocked any teeth out when she fell, but at the same time, Maureen just could not understand how her body had just abruptly shut down like that. She had only fainted one other time in her life, and it was back in college after she had gone on an unusually fast treadmill run. Maureen assumed it was just a fluke because it never happened again. But now she wasn't so sure, because just the week before, during another run, she had felt at one point sort of hazy and actually stopped to rest, but that was obviously nothing compared to today, where she actually fell to the ground. And if this had happened while she was on stairs or something, she could have been seriously injured. And so suddenly, Maureen was terrified. It was like she couldn't trust her body anymore, despite having spent so many years working so hard to become strong and healthy and fit. It was like it didn't matter. Her body was going to do whatever it was going to do. Maureen picked herself up and carefully made her way home, and when she got there, she called her Aunt Eileen, who was a doctor in Pittsburgh. Eileen was a pathologist who ran lab tests on tissue, fluids, and organs in order to diagnose diseases, especially heart disease. But she was knowledgeable about most health issues, so Maureen really wanted her opinion on what had just happened to her. Eileen thought for a moment after Maureen told her about how she had just fainted during her run. Then Eileen told Maureen that she might be experiencing some type of irregular heartbeat. If left untreated, Maureen's aunt said that an irregular heartbeat could cause that lightheadedness and fainting that Maureen experienced. But realistically, that was the most mild of symptoms. This irregular heartbeat could lead to permanent damage to her heart, her brain, and other organs. It could even cause strokes, heart failure, and even death. And so Eileen urged Maureen to stop doing any serious exercise until she could meet with a doctor. Maureen appreciated her aunt's advice, but it was hard to accept. Being physically active and pushing her body to its limits made her feel energized, joyful, and alive. To stop exercising cold turkey would be a real challenge for her, but at the same time, she didn't want to risk fainting again, so she promised her aunt that she would take a break from running and would see a doctor as soon as possible. A few days later, Maureen lay on an examination table wearing a hospital gown. She flinched at the feeling of cold metal as the cardiologist stuck a series of electrodes to her chest. Even so, she was still glad to be there. She had not gone for a run since she talked to her aunt, and she was eager for this to be over with. Once the electrodes were in place, the doctor made sure the cables running to the EKG machine were untangled and connected properly. These would convert electrical signals from Maureen's heart into waves displayed on the EKG grid. By studying these lines, the cardiologist would be able to identify any irregularities in Maureen's heart's activity. Maureen closed her eyes and listened as the doctor flicked a switch. The machinery hummed into action, and soon Maureen could hear the beeps corresponding to her heartbeat. 5 minutes later, the test was over, and so Maureen opened up her eyes. The cardiologist quickly pulled up the results on a large computer monitor. His face was neutral as he scrolled through the data, occasionally stopping just to jot something down on a pad of paper. Finally, the doctor scooted his chair back, set down his pen, and turned to face Maureen. He told her he knew why she had been fainting. She had a condition called Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome. It's a congenital heart defect that makes the heart beat faster than it should, sometimes causing dizziness and fainting. Maureen was relieved to have a name now for what she'd been experiencing, but she was also shaken at the thought that there was something fundamentally wrong with her heart. The doctor could see how worried Maureen was, and so he told her the good news was that this condition was totally treatable using a procedure called a catheter ablation. It's a surgery where thin, flexible tubes are guided into areas of the heart suspected of causing the irregular heartbeat. Then, once it's in place, the surgeon permanently changes the electrical circuitry of the heart by creating scar tissue in these problem areas. Scar tissue does not conduct electricity, so once that's done, the irregular heartbeat disappears and the heart returns to normal. Maureen thought this procedure sounded really intense and pretty complicated, but she was at least happy to have, the next steps in place. So she thanked the cardiologist and said she would schedule this procedure as soon as possible. Back at home, Maureen called her doctor aunt with the news, and Eileen suggested that Maureen have the catheter ablation done in Pittsburgh where she was, so Eileen could look after her after the procedure was done. Maureen agreed, thanked her aunt, and hung up. Then Maureen went for a long walk along the bay, letting her mind wander. She hoped the sea breeze and the lapping waves might calm her nerves, but she was too distracted. All she could hear was the sound of her heartbeat in every footstep. 2 weeks later, Maureen stood outside a hospital in Pittsburgh with her aunt Eileen. Maureen had barely slept the night before, worrying about this catheter ablation, what could go wrong. But eventually, they went inside the hospital, and they went up to the receptionist desk, and they signed in. Once Maureen's name was called, she hugged her aunt goodbye, and she followed a nurse down the hall to get prepped for the operation. As Maureen settled onto a gurney, the nurse explained that the procedure would take about 3 to 6 hours, but Maureen would be sedated the entire time and wouldn't feel a thing and would just kind of wake up when it was done. Then the nurse had Maureen lie back, and she inserted an IV drip into her forearm. Seconds later, Maureen started to feel the warm and dreamy sensation as the sedatives hit, and soon her eyelids were too heavy to keep open, and she drifted off to sleep. Several hours later, as Maureen drifted back to consciousness, she stared up at the lights on the ceiling. It took her a minute to realize where she was, in a recovery room at the hospital, but once she understood where she was, she noticed her doctor was right there looking down at her. And once the doctor saw she was awake, he told her that the procedure was a total success. He said they had been able to find the section of Maureen's heart that was causing the irregularity, and they covered it with scar tissue. The doctor advised Maureen to schedule occasional follow-up EKG tests just to make sure her heartbeat remained steady, but otherwise, she was good to go. She could go back to her normal life. Maureen could not contain her smile. This was everything she had hoped for, and she could not wait to get back on her feet and go for a run. Two decades later, in October of 2022, Maureen sat on her bed shivering and dripping wet, holding a phone to her ear and wishing her Aunt Eileen was with her again. She had just made it back to her Seattle houseboat after fainting during that run in Lake Union Park. One moment she was jogging along happily, the next she was unconscious on the ground in the pouring rain, staring at a bunch of rabbits. It felt like her past heart issues were coming back to haunt her. But Maureen just couldn't understand how that would have happened. The catheter ablation operation she did back in 2000 was supposed to have fixed everything. And she had been exercising and living her life normally for years now without any major problems. But now here she was again, 2 decades later, nauseous and dizzy and passing out on the ground. After waiting a while on hold, Maureen was finally connected to a doctor who was inside of her healthcare plan. She told him about fainting in the park and summarized her fairly extensive medical history. The doctor told her to come in the next day for an EKG and also some blood tests. After she hung up, Maureen just sat there staring at the rain landing on the water. She thought she was done dealing with her body's mysteries, but clearly something else was wrong. The next morning, Maureen woke up early, still feeling rattled. She filled a thermos with coffee, put on a raincoat, and headed to her appointment. Once at the hospital, Maureen explained to the cardiologist how her career as a conservation biologist kept her extremely physically active. Even outside of her work, exercise was her favorite activity. In addition to jogging, Maureen skied, she swam, and went mountain biking. Occasionally, she would still experience a bit of dizziness or nausea, but it passed quickly. And every doctor she'd seen in the 22 years since her catheter ablation always told Maureen the same thing. Her vital signs were right where they should be. The cardiologist nodded and took some notes. Then he had Maureen lie back and arranged a series of electrodes on her chest for another EKG. Maureen took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and focused on the soothing hum of the machine as it measured her heartbeat. After a few minutes, the cardiologist pushed back his chair from the computer and came to Maureen's side and helped her sit up. Maureen braced herself for bad news from this test, but the cardiologist only shrugged, shook his head, and told Maureen that her results were normal. Nothing looked out of the ordinary. Maureen felt lost and frustrated. She knew the test had to be wrong because she was positive something wasn't right in her body. Last night in the park, she genuinely thought she was going to die. So how could this EKG test show nothing? It made no sense. The cardiologist told Maureen to call if she experienced the symptoms again, but until then, there really wasn't anything he or the hospital could do. Maureen thanked the doctor and appreciated what he was doing, but she knew now it was up to her to do some research of her own. Back at her houseboat, Maureen sat on the deck with a cup of coffee, a stack of books, and a printed copy of her test results. She had stopped by the library on the way home to check out a few books on heart conditions. Maureen's career as a conservation biologist had trained her to identify patterns in complex data, so studying EKG results did not seem overwhelming to her. The chart showed the electrical energy of her heartbeat on a graph. Each heartbeat looked like a spike as the blood is pushed out, with a little hiccup before and after it. She could see exactly how much electrical energy was being transmitted each time her heart beat, and exactly how long each beat lasted. After looking at these charts for a while, Maureen noticed an irregularity in her heartbeat that the doctor had not mentioned. The amount of time from when her heartbeat spiked to when her heart was ready for the next beat seemed to vary from beat to beat. Sometimes it was very short, and other times it was much longer. This worried Maureen because she knew the heart is supposed to beat very evenly. So she grabbed the phone and called her Aunt Eileen. Her aunt recognized it immediately as a heart condition that can cause fast, unpredictable heartbeats. It's called long QT syndrome, and it's very tricky to diagnose because most patients actually show no symptoms. But for those that do, the most common symptoms are lightheadedness, blurred vision, and fainting, just like Maureen had. Eileen recommended a doctor in Seattle who specialized in heart disorders. If Maureen did have long QT syndrome, he'd be able to confirm it. Maureen thanked her aunt for all her help and said she would call back once she had news. On a cold and gray winter morning the following month, Maureen was back at the hospital in Seattle, this time carrying a bag containing her workout clothes and running shoes. She followed a nurse into the cardiology wing, then into a changing room where she put on her workout clothes. A few minutes later, a man knocked and introduced himself as the doctor that Maureen's aunt had recommended. He led Maureen down the hallway to a larger room with a treadmill right in the middle. The doctor then hooked pulse monitors to Maureen's wrist and forearms, and he explained that he'd be monitoring her heartbeat and blood pressure while she ran on the treadmill. That way, he could determine what was changing inside her body during vigorous exercise. Maureen did some stretching and then began a brisk walk as the doctor slowly accelerated the treadmill. Soon, Maureen was sweating, huffing, and running at full speed. And all the while, the doctor just kept his eyes on his screen. And after running for a little bit, Maureen suddenly felt a very familiar sensation. Her peripheral vision turned foggy, her head felt woozy, and then before she could do anything, she was falling face first onto the rubber mat of the treadmill. When Maureen blinked back to consciousness, she looked up and saw this big group of men and women wearing hospital scrubs crouched down around her. One of them reached down and helped scoop her up into a sitting position. And as they did that, Maureen realized this was an emergency resuscitation team that had been called in when she fainted to resuscitate her. The doctor who had been overseeing the running test came over and crouched down by Maureen's side. He explained that her blood pressure and heart rate had plummeted when she was running, and then she passed out. It happened too fast for anyone to catch her. But the doctor told her that this test had actually been really useful because the results showed her issue wasn't a problem with her heart. It was more likely a complicated fainting condition sometimes seen in athletes. For Maureen, intense exercise was short-circuiting the nerve endings that regulated her heartbeat. This caused her blood pressure to drop, which in turn slowed the flow of blood to her brain. This is what made her feel lightheaded and dizzy to the point of fainting. Maureen, who was still sitting on the treadmill, was dazed by the diagnosis. Every doctor she had seen for the past 20 years had told her there was something wrong with her heart, that was the issue. But now it sounded like the problem was actually in her brain. Maureen asked the doctor, what do I do? How do I keep myself from fainting? The doctor smiled and told Maureen she was actually in luck. To get around the nerve issues and stabilize her blood pressure, all she would need to do was consume 1.5 teaspoons of ordinary table salt every day. Now, that's more salt than most people consume on a daily basis, but it was just enough above the normal amount that it would raise her blood pressure to the point where she would not faint the next time she did strenuous exercise. This sounded almost too easy to Maureen, but at the same time, she was grateful that she had a cure. She got to her feet, thanked everyone, and then went to go buy some salt. But a month later, on a cloudy, rainy Seattle afternoon, Maureen, who was very frustrated, stepped out onto the deck of her houseboat and dumped her salt into the water. She was totally done with this cure. Daily doses of salt had done nothing. For weeks, Maureen had been dissolving salt in a tall glass of warm water and forcing herself to drink it. At first, she held out hope that she might eventually start to see some changes, but she never did. Consuming all this salt had only made her bloated and anxious. It did nothing for her heart. Even on light jogs, Maureen's chest would feel tight, her stomach would turn queasy, and she'd be out of breath like she was about to faint. So whatever was wrong with her heart was definitely still wrong, and the salt was doing nothing to fix it. Frustrated, Maureen again called her Aunt Eileen for advice for what felt like the millionth time. This time, Eileen recommended that Maureen reach out to a very specific physician named Dr. Samir Saba, who specialized in a very special kind of MRI scan that identifies diseases and defects in the heart. Despite the diagnosis Maureen had received, Eileen still thought there really could be issues with her heart. And so this special MRI test, which gives very detailed pictures of the heart, might actually finally answer what was going on with Maureen. Now, Maureen was skeptical that anybody could figure out her mysterious condition after so many other doctors had tried and failed, but she had nowhere else to turn, and so Maureen asked her aunt to go ahead and book her one of these special MRI scans with Dr. Saba, and while she did that, Maureen would buy a flight to Pittsburgh. A week later, Maureen sat nervously in the front passenger seat as her Aunt Eileen drove to the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. Maureen watched out the window as a soft drizzle fell across the city, the same damp gray weather she was used to back in Seattle. She looked forward to being back on her cozy houseboat, but before she could go home, she still had this one last test she had to take. Maureen shuddered at the sight of yet another hospital as they got out and began walking towards the building. Once they went inside, Maureen followed a nurse through several sets of double doors into a white-walled, brightly lit MRI room. The nurse helped Maureen get undressed while she explained the procedure. A magnetic resonance image, or MRI, can create 3D images of the organs and tissues inside of a person's body. These detailed images allow doctors to find heart damage without needing to perform surgery on the patient. Maureen climbed up onto the stark white table and laid down flat. She heard a machine whir, then the table, with her on it, slid inside a narrow tube. At first, it felt claustrophobic, but Maureen shut her eyes and just pictured herself going for a run, and it put her at ease. Maureen lay there, listening to the sounds of the imaging machine, and then after about an hour, the noises stopped, and she, on her gurney, was slid back out from the tube. Maureen sat up, feeling strangely relaxed. Dr. Saba was there waiting for her, and he told her it would take a couple of weeks to get the results back, but he would call her as soon as he could. 2 weeks later, Maureen was back on her houseboat in Seattle, Washington, when her phone rang. The caller ID said University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. Bracing herself for more frustrations or worse, Maureen answered and heard Dr. Saba's voice on the line. He told her he had some absolutely wild news. The issue with Maureen's heart was something that none of her previous doctors had thought of. Not only that, but it was something Maureen had lived with her entire life. The problem with Maureen's heart had nothing to do with its beat or nerve endings or scar tissue or any of the other things doctors had talked about for all these years. Instead, Maureen's heart was the wrong shape. The major artery carrying the blood from Maureen's heart to her body was literally in the wrong place, and so her unusual anatomy was causing Maureen's blackouts, not all the other rare conditions that doctors had thought previously. Maureen's right coronary artery was squished underneath another large blood vessel so that it was slightly constricted. When Maureen went about her normal activities, there wasn't any issues. But when Maureen exercised, her heart had to beat faster and pump more and more blood to keep up. But since her artery was in the wrong place and compressed, eventually it couldn't hold enough blood to meet the needs of the heart. This caused Maureen to faint. And no doctor would ever think to suspect this as the cause, because less than 1% of the entire population has a structural defect like this one. But the dangers of this rare condition are extremely real. Dr. Saba told Maureen that her collapse in the park was more likely a heart attack, and if it had lasted much longer, she would have died. Maureen was speechless. Across 20-plus years of seeing doctors throughout the country, no one had ever mentioned even the existence of a condition like this. She'd been living with a misshapen heart since she was born, and without Dr. Saba, it's very possible she would have never found out and likely died from it. Later that summer, Maureen underwent a 3-hour-long open-heart surgery at the University of Washington Medical Center in Seattle, in which surgeons successfully moved her right coronary artery, the one that was in the wrong spot, over to its proper location. Maureen still has lingering chest tightness and fatigue, but the operation allowed her to go back to her physically active life without fear. Gradually, she was able to start fully exercising again, and though her speed is not what it once was, Maureen has never fainted since. "32-year-old Morris Blankenbaker was a very happy man. The gymnasium at Wapato Intermediate School in Yakima County, Washington, echoed with the sound of young teenage boys practicing their wrestling moves on thick green mats. And Morris was right there with them, whistle on a cord around his neck, shouting directions and encouragement as he moved from one group of kids to another. As far back as he could remember, the thump of bodies hitting the mats and the rhythm of other youngsters in a tight line at the edge of the gym doing calisthenics had always been music to Morris's ears. It had been 14 years since Morris himself had graduated from high school 15 miles to the north, along with his armload of sports trophies, the title of Best Athlete of 1961, and a 4-year scholarship to play football in college. But even though he had not achieved his dream of becoming a professional football player, Morris had never for a second lost his love of sports, both playing them and coaching them. But on this particular day, Friday, November 21st, 1975, Morris's sense of happiness and satisfaction with his life went much deeper than normal. Because the last 2 years of Morris's life had taught the former Golden Boy of Yakima County that the really important things in life were the 2 things he had come so close to losing: his marriage to his high school sweetheart, Deanne, and the joy of living under the same roof with her and their 2 young children. Though no one, not even Deanne and definitely not Morris himself, could ever have predicted the chain of events that had temporarily led to his separation and divorce from Deanne. And while Morris knew the shockwaves from those events were still reverberating throughout his work and social circles, the last few days had brought both Morris and Deanne a very rare feeling of calm and peace. And as they both looked forward to Thanksgiving together, just 6 days away, Morris had to believe that all the turmoil of the last 2 years was finally ebbing out of their lives, and that going forward, he and Deanne would never again take each other for granted. The sudden ring of the school bell pulled Morris back to the present. With a quick glance at the clock on the wall, he raised the whistle around his neck up to his mouth, and he blew 2 sharp blasts to signal the end of the practice. A moment later, and the boys were hauling their mats back to the hooks on the walls at either end of the gym. Hearing their respectful, "Thanks, coach, goodbyes," as the teenagers filed past him on their way into the locker room to change, Morris remembered an earlier scene from his own adolescence, and he felt a stab of pain. He had been just a few years older than these kids when he had first met his own favorite coach, Talmadge Glenn Moore, back in Davis High School 16 years ago. Known to everyone in Yakima County by his nickname, Gabby, and known to all the boys he had coached in everything from wrestling to track to football as just Coach, Gabby was one of Yakima's local celebrities. Ever since getting his first job coaching at Washington Junior High School back in 1958, Gabby had quickly moved up the career ladder, and by 1969, he'd made a name for himself as one of the most outstanding wrestling coaches in the entire country. And in 1972, at the very height of his career, Gabby had coached the David High School wrestling team all the way to first place in the Washington State Championships. But instead of accepting any offers to coach at the collegiate level, Gabby and his wife had chosen to stay in Yakima, a small agricultural town separated from the much larger city of Seattle to the north by the beautiful Cascade Mountain Range. And it wasn't just Gabby's coaching talent that had made him so popular in Yakima. It was also his ability to motivate and mentor even the most disadvantaged young men who went on to find purpose and promise as members of Gabby's various sports teams. When Morris had returned to Yakima in 1969, he and his former coach had reconnected. As adults now, rather than coach and student, they had struck up a friendship that included going hunting together, as well as going whitewater rafting, boating, and spearfishing. For Morris especially, life had changed a lot since he had graduated from high school. Despite getting that 4-year college football scholarship, Morris wound up dropping out of Washington State University and joining the Marine Corps Reserves instead. That was also when Morris and his longtime sweetheart, Deanne, who had just graduated from high school in Yakima, got married and settled down in Tacoma, a city of 109,000, perched alongside the Puget Sound on the west coast, under the shadow of the huge snow-capped mountain called Mount Rainier. But by the time Morris was honorably discharged from the Marine Corps Reserves at the age of 27, and when Deanne was 24, the young couple was ready to move back to Yakima, where they would be closer to their families. And over the next 4 years, Morris would eventually finish his degree by studying part-time at a community college 35 miles away and while working several jobs, until he landed the position he had now at Wapato Intermediate School. In the meantime, Deanne had found a good job with a local bank in Yakima, and they had 2 young children, a little boy and a little girl. And in all that time, from 1965, when Morris and Deanne had married in the Presbyterian Church in Yakima, through the years they had spent in Tacoma and their move back here to Yakima and the birth of their 2 kids, Morris had always felt like their marriage was as close to perfection as anything he'd ever known. Both he and Deanne were children of divorce. Morris had been raised from the age of 2 by his single mother, who had carved out a modest living for herself and her beloved only child as a highly trained court reporter. Deanne had come from a much wealthier family, but her parents' divorce had left her with a deep longing to find permanence and stability in a family of her own. And in Morris, the strong and gentle man she had first laid eyes on when she was just 14, Deanne was sure she had found her life partner. And in Deanne, Morris knew he had found the one and only person he would ever love. But all that would change starting in December of 1973. That's when Gabby, Morris's good friend and the coach he had admired for so many years, asked to come live with Morris and Deanne and their 2 kids. Morris had been stunned when Gabby explained that his wife of 20 years had kicked him out of the family home. To Morris, his coach's marriage had also seemed perfect. Gabby and his wife had 3 happy kids, they were financially well off, and they both shared the same passion, sports. Also, Gabby was just a total straight arrow, a complete stickler for modeling the behavior that he expected of the young men he coached. No drinking, no smoking, no drugs, and no messing around with girls. When Morris asked his former coach what had gone wrong, Gabby said that, like a lot of couples, he and his wife had just sort of drifted apart. But Gabby was sure he could win his wife back and persuade her not to file for a divorce. He just needed a place to live for a few weeks so he could pull himself together and then launch his campaign to save his marriage. Morris had not hesitated. This was the man who had inspired Morris's own decision to become a coach and physical education instructor. This was the man who had helped Morris become one of the best football players Yakima County had ever seen. And, most importantly, this man was Morris's friend, and Gabby obviously needed Morris's help. But delivering that help had been harder than Morris expected. In the end, it had taken Morris almost a month to override Deanne's objections to this plan of Morris's former coach coming to live with them. While Gabby had been one of Morris's friends, Deanne hardly even knew the 41-year-old wrestling coach, and her life was already hard enough. Money was tight, she was juggling a job and taking care of the kids. The last thing Deanne wanted was yet another person in the house that she would need to feed and clean up after. But by January of 1974, Deanne had finally agreed. Now, as Morris walked out of Wapato Intermediate School into the chilly, cloudy November afternoon, he wished he had listened to Deanne and found some other way to help his old coach. Getting into his car in the school parking lot, Morris glanced again at his watch. Deanne was working at the bank until about 6 that evening, so Morris would have the afternoon with their kids before they all ate dinner together, and then Morris headed off to his second job as a bouncer at a local tavern in Yakima called the Lion's Share. There, from 8 p.m. until 2 a.m., Morris would check IDs so the bar wouldn't be serving any underage drinkers, and Morris would also just keep the peace. It had been years since he'd played college football, but at 5 foot 11 inches tall and weighing 210 pounds, Morris was not only still in great physical shape, but he also had a patient temperament and a knack for diffusing tense situations. Not that either of those qualities had been of any use to Morris back in January of 1974, when Gabby had arrived on their doorstep with his suitcases and his charming smile. It had only taken a couple of weeks for Morris to realize that his old coach was a very different man than the one who had preached such high standards of clean living and integrity to his students. It turned out Gabby had a very serious drinking problem. But at the same time that Morris realized his coach was headed at top speed down the road to full-blown alcoholism, Deanne's objections to Gabby's presence had strangely totally vanished. Gabby was good at holding the whiskey he had started drinking by the bottleful, secretly during the day, and not so secretly at night after Deanne had gone to bed. And Gabby soon charmed Deanne by the help he offered with the kids, the sympathetic ear he offered to Deanne as she told him about the stress of never having quite enough money, how quick he was to lend a hand with laundry and grocery shopping, and the way he looked at her. Deanne had met Morris when she was 14 and when he was 17, and they had been a couple since Deanne had turned 16. By the time Gabby, the legendary local celebrity, arrived on the scene, Deanne was 27, and most of the passion and all the romance had drained out of her marriage with Morris. And even if Morris did not seem to notice at all, it was crystal clear to Deanne that Gabby found her captivating and sexy. So when Gabby taught Deanne how to drive his late-model golden brown MG sports car, and their hands happened to touch as Gabby showed her how to use the stick shift, Deanne welcomed the thrill and sense of excitement she felt. It didn't take long for Gabby to forget any plans he had made to win back his wife of 20 years. Instead, he could hardly wait for his divorce to become final. And it took Deanne just 2.5 months of knowing Gabby to trade Morris's steadfast devotion and predictability for Gabby's promises of a beautiful house in the best part of town and a daring and exciting love life. So, just halfway through April, when the Yakima County apple orchards were starting to bloom, and just 10 weeks after Gabby had first arrived on the Blankenbaker's doorstep, Deanne left her husband of 9 years and moved in with his former coach and trusted friend, Gabby. Gabby had recently left the Blankenbaker residence and got a place of his own. Deanne took Morris's 2 young children with her to the new house, where Gabby's own 3 children were regular visitors. As Morris pulled his car into the driveway of his home at 210 North 6th Street, he remembered the total shock he had felt when Deanne had told him she was leaving. Morris had been so busy working and so focused on the ways in which his old coach seemed to be falling apart in front of his eyes that he had been completely blind to the betrayal that was taking place right under his nose. Unlike Deanne, Morris had discovered why Gabby's wife had kicked Gabby out in the first place. Gabby had apparently become totally obsessed with his wife, and that obsession drove him to become paranoid that she was being unfaithful. Fed up with Gabby's accusations and his increasingly controlling behavior, his wife had ended their relationship, kicked him out of the house, and started a new life on her own. Looking back, Morris wished he had told Deanne about that side of Gabby. But at the time, given his wife's initial objections to Gabby coming and staying with them, Morris had not wanted to pile on and make his old friend look even worse in Deanne's eyes. Even through his shock and hurt when Deanne told him about her affair with Gabby, Morris couldn't help but think that Deanne's decision to leave was so impulsive and sudden that maybe someday she would change her mind and come back to him. So instead of losing his temper and destroying whatever feelings he and Deanne had left for one another, Morris had dug deep into his soul and told his wife that no matter what happened, he loved her and he would always be there for her. But once Deanne and the children had gone, Morris was totally devastated. And when Deanne and Gabby had announced they were going to get married on September 14th, 1974, just 3 months after Deanne officially divorced Morris, and just 9 months after Gabby had first moved in with the Blankenbakers, Morris promptly packed up his stuff and moved to Hawaii. 4 months later, though, Morris was back in Yakima. He just couldn't stand to be that far away from his 2 kids and from his mother Olive, who had just been through an illness serious enough that she had wound up in the hospital. Once back in town, Morris began picking up the pieces of his life. That's when he bought the 4-bedroom house at North and 6th Street and rented out rooms to some of his friends to help pay for the mortgage. And in the meantime, Deanne's storybook romance with the man who was 14 years her senior had already begun to fall apart. Once Gabby and Deanne were living together, Gabby did not try to hide his drinking, and Deanne was horrified as her new husband knocked off an entire 5th of whiskey at least 3 or 4 nights a week, sometimes locking Deanne out of the house and screaming accusations that she was seeing other men. After 3 separations from Gabby, the longest lasting 2 weeks, Deanne had had enough, and in July of 1975, 10 months after getting married to Gabby, Deanne was filing for her second divorce. And this time, when she left her dream home on the better side of Yakima, Deanne took her kids straight back to her ex-husband Morris and his much less glamorous wooden frame house on North and 6th that was separated by just a little alleyway from a hodgepodge assortment of apartments and 2 family homes. Even as Morris and Deanne made plans to remarry as soon as Deanne's divorce from Gabby was finalized, Deanne dropped Gabby's last name, trading Moore for Blankenbaker. As Morris let himself into the house he now shared again with Deanne and his 2 kids, he told himself that he should have known that his old coach, competitive to the bone, would not let Deanne go without a fight. But what neither Deanne nor Morris had expected was the intensity of Gabby's anger and jealousy when Deanne left him to go back to Morris. Just a week earlier, in mid-November, while Morris had been working at the Lion's Share, he'd received a terrified phone call from Deanne telling him that Gabby had let himself into their house through an unlocked door, and he was now at the door of the master bedroom where Deanne had been sleeping. Deanne had heard someone inside the house and had had just enough time to lock the bedroom door before Gabby arrived and started pounding on the door, begging Deanne to take him back and threatening to kick the door down. Morris had grabbed one of his good friends who was at the tavern, and the 2 of them jumped into Morris's car and they drove at high speed from the Lion's Share back to Morris's house. There, they found Gabby, completely drunk, staggering around the outside of the Blankenbaker home, pounding on the downstairs windows, waving a gun, and threatening to kill himself or Morris. The friend that Morris had brought with him from the Lion's Share, Joey Watkins, another former student of Coach Gabby's, expected a fight between these 2 men. He was also stunned at the change in his former coach, who had always lectured everyone about self-control and the importance of staying away from alcohol. But instead of busting Gabby in the mouth, Morris went up to his old coach and talked to him quietly, getting him to stow the gun, get back into his car, and go back to the apartment that Gabby now shared with his 16-year-old son, Mike. To Joey, Morris had just shrugged his shoulders and said, "I could have hit him, but he was my coach too. I just can't do it." There was also another bond between Morris and Coach Gabby. Morris had once saved his coach's life. On one of the river trips that Gabby and Morris used to take together, their boat had capsized and both men had been pulled underwater by a deep current. Morris made it to the surface, but Gabby had been caught underwater in a tangle of vines and roots near the Yakima riverbank. Always an excellent swimmer, Morris had managed to dive down and free Gabby's legs and bring his former coach safely back to land, where Gabby coughed up the water in his lungs that had come so close to killing him. This event was yet another reason why Gabby's later betrayal in starting an affair with Morris's wife had hurt Morris so deeply. But it had also given Morris a sense that on some level he had assumed a kind of responsibility for this man, whose life was so obviously coming completely undone. And besides, not long after that night when Morris had confronted Gabby out in the yard, it seemed like Gabby had finally gotten the message and was leaving Morris and Deanne alone. Starting on November 18th, neither Morris nor Deanne had seen or heard from Gabby. And that was when Deanne and Morris had finally begun to feel that both the turmoil and the gossip around Deanne divorcing 2 different husbands in less than a year and a half was actually over. With that final thought, Morris turned his full attention back to his children. And by the time Deanne arrived home from work at around 6:30 on the evening of November 21st, the whole family was ready to go out for Friday night pizza at Shakey's restaurant before Morris headed off to his night shift at the Lion's Share. At 5 a.m. the next morning, November 22nd, Deanne suddenly woke up feeling totally alarmed. She realized even before her eyes had adjusted to the dark that Morris was not in bed next to her. Getting out of bed and pulling on her bathrobe, Deanne hustled down the stairs and stepped out onto the front porch of the house to see if her husband's car was outside. And it was. Morris always parked at the end of their driveway that sort of wrapped around the back of the house, and so Deanne had walked over to the far side of their front porch and looked back in that direction, and she saw his car. Wondering if her husband had just fallen asleep in his car after coming home very late from his shift at the Lion's Share, Deanne walked down the porch steps and took a left and walked around the house towards the back, where she peered inside of her husband's car, but Morris was not inside. Puzzled, Deanne retraced her steps back to the front of the house, and then after going inside, she put on her contact lenses and then began searching every room of the house for Morris. But after searching every room, it was clear Morris was not inside. So, grabbing the collar of the family dog, Deanne went back outside, and this time, after going down the front porch steps onto the front lawn, she turned right and walked around that side of the house to reach the backyard. This side of the house, which was the left side if you were facing the house from the street, butted up against an alleyway. This alleyway was only separated from the house's property by a flimsy, short chicken wire fence, a barrier that was more psychological than physical. Between that chicken wire fence and the side of the house was a narrow stretch of grass that ran from the front yard straight back to the backyard. So after Deanne turned the corner and started walking down that stretch of grass, she suddenly stopped, because there on the ground near the open gate that separated the front yard from the backyard was the figure of a man lying face down on the grass. A moment later, 2 neighbors who were waiting on the curb outside their nearby apartments to catch their rides to go out duck hunting heard a woman's frantic screams from across the alley. "Morris! Morris! Oh my God, he's dead!" By 5:25 a.m., Yakima police and medical personnel had already started arriving at the scene, lining up out front of the house on 210 North and 6th Street. And even before Yakima's chief homicide detective, Robert Brimmer, arrived 15 minutes later, first responders already knew 3 things. 1, the dead man laid out on the grass under the first thin layer of falling snow was Yakima's popular intermediate school coach, 32-year-old Morris Blankenbaker. 2, given the stiffness of the body, Morris must have been killed hours before Deanne had dialed 911. And 3, the obvious cause of Morris's death was gunshot wounds. By the time Sergeant Brimmer pulled up, Officers were already surrounding the Blankenbaker property with yellow crime scene tape, and Deanne was inside the house with her wide-eyed children crying hysterically. Using flashlights, police officers searched every inch of the south side of the house where Morris's body had been discovered, hoping that the flashlight beams might glint off the shiny metal of a shell casing buried in the 3 to 4 inch deep grass. They also searched the nearby alleyway and all the trash barrels in case the killer had thrown the murder weapon into one of them. But all police found at the crime scene was a mostly empty bottle of beer that Morris had probably been carrying in his hand when he got out of his car. By 8:30 a.m., Morris's body had been taken to the county morgue, where an autopsy would be performed at 7 p.m. that night, and Detective Brimmer and his investigators were at the Yakima police station and fanning out through the Blankenbaker's neighborhood, interviewing witnesses and putting together a list of possible suspects. In most murders, the victim's spouse is at the top of that list, but it didn't take detectives long to rule Deanne out as a suspect. There was no trace of gun residue on her hands or clothing. Morris did not have a life insurance policy that might have given Deanne a financial motive for murder, and as the whole town knew, Deanne had just recently reconciled with Morris, and the two were planning to remarry. But what Deanne did have for police was the name of the man she was certain had to be behind Morris's death, and that was Morris's one-time friend and mentor, Gabby Moore, the man Deanne herself had only recently divorced. Deanne wasted no time telling Detective Brimmer about the incident just the week before, when the coach had shown up with a gun one night when Morris was working at the tavern, and how Gabby had entered the Blankenbaker house and threatened to break down the door to her bedroom. Deanne also told them about the harassing phone calls Gabby had made to their house almost every day, and Gabby's attempts to get his children and Deanne's own sister to try to pressure and guilt-trip Deanne into going back to Gabby. But even after hearing these details about what sounded like Gabby's obsession with winning back Deanne, Detective Brimmer just could not believe that Gabby, who literally owed his life to Morris, would have just walked up to Morris and shot him in cold blood. But lacking any other obvious suspects and having no evidence from the crime scene that provided police with any other leads in the case, Detective Brimmer picked up the phone and called Gabby, asking him to come to the police station and bring along any firearms he owned. Coach Gabby did come to the police station that Saturday afternoon, but he brought along an attorney, and he had nothing he wanted to say to police, except to point out that he could not possibly have committed this murder since he had been in the hospital from November 18th until hours after Morris's body had been discovered. It would turn out that the peaceful interlude that Morris and Deanne had enjoyed for the last few days when Gabby had finally seemed ready to leave them alone, it was actually just the result of Gabby experiencing such stress-related high blood pressure that his doctor had ordered Gabby into the hospital for treatment and observation. And after interviewing hospital and nursing staff, and even checking the windows and doors of the hospital for any possible way that Gabby might have slipped out to commit the murder, investigators would confirm Gabby's alibi. Over the next 3 weeks, police worked every possible lead and motive in the homicide case. They investigated any arguments Morris may have had with customers at the Lion's Share, arguments he might have had with parents, with students, or other teachers at the middle school where Morris worked, and every single one of those avenues led nowhere. Meanwhile, now that Gabby was out of the hospital, he picked up right where he had left off, trying to win Deanne back. He called her almost every day, and any time one of Gabby's friends, or a student on one of his teams, or a fellow coach or teacher stopped by to visit, the coach seemed oblivious to Morris's murder. Instead, all he could talk about was how much he missed Deanne and how much he wanted and needed her back. By early December, Gabby's drinking had gotten so bad that even the efforts of his assistant coach to cover for Gabby's failure to show up for practices and even meets were just not enough. Despite the awards and acclaim that Gabby's outstanding talents as a coach and mentor had brought to Yakima County, and to so many young men who had Gabby to thank for college sports scholarships, Yakima school administrators informed Gabby that they would be ending his teaching contract at the end of that school year. But even this blow to Gabby's ego and his reputation hardly seemed to register, because there was something else now worrying Coach Gabby, and this time he didn't call his lawyer before talking to Detective Brimmer. According to Gabby, someone was now threatening his life. The coach told police that he had received a phone call from someone whose voice he didn't recognize, telling the coach, "I got Morris, and I'm gonna get you next." But despite these reports, and despite Gabby's airtight alibi for the time of Morris's murder, there was one detective who just couldn't shake the feeling that the coach had to have been involved in some way in Morris's murder, and that Gabby was now making up these threats to direct police attention away from himself. And that detective was Morris's best friend, Vern Henderson. Vern and Morris had gone to high school together, and they had both been Coach Gabby's protégés. But while Gabby had never made it into professional football, Vern had realized his dream of becoming a cop. And on the day that Morris had been found murdered, 32-year-old Vern Henderson had sworn to Morris's mother, Olive, that Vern would find her son's killer. So, in those weeks after his best friend's death, Detective Henderson had started casually chatting up some of Gabby's current and former team members, hoping that someone might have heard or seen something, anything, that might connect Gabby to Morris's murder. But then, at about 1 a.m. on December 25th, 1975, early Christmas morning, Yakima police received a 911 call that turned Detective Henderson's theory and Deanne's suspicions about Coach Gabby upside down. At about 8 p.m. on Christmas Eve, Coach Gabby's 16-year-old son, Mike, said goodbye to his father before leaving to join his girlfriend's family for a Christmas Eve dinner. Mike had done his best to cheer his father up that day, and even Gabby's first ex-wife had come over to the apartment Gabby and Mike shared to clean and vacuum and wash the stack of dirty dishes piling up in the sink. And later that evening, right through to 12:15 a.m., other people who cared about Gabby, his daughter, and the same doctor who had ordered Gabby into the hospital just a month ago, all called to check in and see how Gabby was managing over the holidays. Gabby, who was an expert at covering up just how much he was drinking, had told them he was doing okay and that he wasn't completely alone since he expected more members of his wrestling teams to come by and visit. It wasn't until 1 a.m. on Christmas Day, December 25th, when Mike and his girlfriend came back to Gabby's apartment, that anyone realized Gabby was anything but okay. The first sign of trouble was the fact that the back door into Gabby's kitchen was propped wide open, and when Mike walked through that door, he saw his father's body lying sprawled between the kitchen and living rooms. Gabby was face down and not moving. Despite the fact that there was a .22 caliber shell casing lying about 2 feet away from Gabby's body, there was no blood anywhere and no sign of a struggle. It wasn't until the medics who answered Mike's 911 call put Gabby's body onto a stretcher that they realized that Gabby had not died of a heart attack or other natural causes. Because as soon as they had turned Gabby over, blood began pouring out of a bullet hole just under his left armpit. An autopsy would later reveal that a small caliber bullet that matched the shell casing found near Gabby's body, as well as the bullets that had killed Morris Blankenbaker 1 month earlier, had entered somewhere under Coach's shoulder, ricocheted off of his fourth rib, and torn across the inside of his chest, ripping through his heart and both lungs. By the time the medics arrived, 6 pints of blood had collected in Gabby's chest cavity, and as soon as his body was moved, that blood, more than half of all the blood in Gabby's body, started draining out, quickly soaking the small throw rug under the coach's chest. Suddenly, Detective Brimmer and Vern Henderson realized that Gabby's reports that he was being threatened had likely been true. On the day after Christmas, Yakima residents woke up to yet another shocking front-page headline. Quote, "Tied to Blankenbaker slaying? Davis wrestling coach shot, killed." End quote. Meanwhile, Detectives Brimmer and Henderson didn't need reporters to tell them that the murders of the city's 2 coaches, both recently married to the same woman and both shot with the same .22 caliber handgun, had to be related. And the first person they wanted to talk to was Deanne. Even if Deanne did not kill Morris, maybe she was so convinced that Gabby had a hand in that murder that she shot Gabby out of hatred and revenge. They also wondered if maybe Deanne had yet a third admirer, another person so obsessed with wanting her that they would kill both Morris and Gabby. But within 48 hours, detectives were back to square one. Not only did Deanne deny any involvement in Gabby's murder, and the existence of some third mystery lover, she had an airtight alibi for the time of Gabby's murder. She and her children had spent all of Christmas Eve and Christmas Day with family. And as far as anyone knew, the only two serious relationships Deanne had had since the age of 16 were with Morris and Gabby. Now investigators were back to their original theory that revolved around a single killer who may or may not have been known and trusted by both victims. Maybe this person had surprised Morris so completely that Morris never even tried to fight off the shooter. As for Gabby, the autopsy showed that at the time of death, he had 3 times the legal limit of alcohol in his bloodstream, which means he probably would have been too drunk to defend himself from an attacker. Frustrated and baffled, Detective Henderson turned once again to the people who were among the last to see Gabby alive. That group included several members of the coach's so-called wrestling posse, who were a combination of current and former student athletes who had stopped in to visit Gabby on Christmas Eve. According to the boys from this posse, once they were at Gabby's place, they had tried to convince Gabby to come out with them and have some fun. But Gabby had repeatedly said no, he was going to stay put. And so by 12:15 a.m., Gabby's posse gave up and they left, leaving Gabby all alone in his apartment, sitting in his favorite chair, listening to sad love songs. It would not be until Monday, February 23, 1976, 3 months after Morris was gunned down outside of his house, and 2 months after Gabby was murdered, that police received the tip that would break the double homicide investigation wide open. 2 days earlier, 2 teenage brothers out fishing off a small island under the twin bridges that crossed the Natchez River had made a totally unexpected discovery. Lying on the bank of that island in about 3 inches of water, the boys had found a rusty, older model .22 caliber automatic pistol with a long barrel. By Monday, their father was standing in Detective Brimmer's office. When the man placed the gun down on the investigator's desk, Detective Brimmer knew immediately that he must be staring at the weapon that had been used to murder both Morris and Gabby. That same day, the Yakima Herald-Republic newspaper reported that a gun had been found in the Natchez River. A few days later, Yakima law enforcement got a visit from the person who claimed not only to own that gun, but who also knew how the gun had turned up in the Natchez River and why. Based on that new information and follow-up interviews conducted by Detectives Brimmer and Henderson and other investigators, here is a reconstruction of what happened on the night Morris Blankenbaker was killed and the night 1 month later when Gabby Moore was also shot to death inside of his apartment. It would turn out that Coach Gabby had spent a lot of time talking to a lot of people about how horrible his life had become since Deanne had left him to go back to her first husband, Morris Blankenbaker. And one of those people was listening very carefully to what Gabby had to say. After this person approached Gabby and asked if there was any way to help, Gabby said, actually, yes, there is a way. And by mid-November, Gabby had outlined for this person an entire plan that he felt sure would result in Deanne taking him back. And on the evening of November 21st, when Gabby was in the hospital being treated for the repeated nosebleeds that were a result of his high blood pressure, he decided to put this plan into action. At about 7 p.m., the coach got out of his hospital bed and walked down the corridor to the payphone near the visitor's lobby. He placed one call and then went straight back to his room. 7 hours later, Morris arrived home from his shift as a bouncer at the Lion's Share Tavern. After parking his car in its usual place on the driveway behind his house, Morris sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes, enjoying the bottle of beer that he'd brought with him from work. Looking up at the upstairs windows of his house, he thought of the Thanksgiving that he and Deanne would share together with their kids next week. Suddenly, he was just eager to get inside and slip into bed and hold Deanne tightly in his arms. So he turned off the engine and dropped the car keys onto the floor in front of the passenger seat, and then he got out and closed the driver's side door behind him and began walking toward the front of the house. To get there, he walked alongside the south side of the house, the same side of the house that was closest to that alleyway separated from his property only by a short chicken wire fence. When Morris reached the little gate on his property on the south side of his house that separated his backyard from his front yard, he was about to walk through that gate when he heard a voice off to his right somewhere in the alleyway calling out his name. Morris stopped where he was and turned with the beer bottle still in his hand and stared out at the alleyway to see if someone was actually there or if he had just imagined someone calling his name. But sure enough, when he looked at the alleyway, standing there was someone he knew well. Before Morris could react to them, this person told Morris that they had actually just run out of gas, and they gestured toward the end of the alleyway, kind of beckoning Morris to come over and help them. As Morris stepped closer to the chicken wire fence to look down the alleyway toward this person's car, the person in the alleyway raised a hidden pistol, aimed it directly at Morris's face, and fired. The first bullet hit Morris just above his front teeth, and the force of the bullet spun him sideways as he fell to the ground. The second two bullets came in quick succession, hitting Morris just behind his left ear. Without saying another word, Morris's killer turned and ran down the alleyway out of sight. One of the Blankenbaker's neighbors would later tell police that at about 2:10 a.m. on November 22nd, she'd heard what she thought were firecrackers and then the sound of someone in heavy shoes running past her ground floor window. 1 month later, and Gabby was more desperate than ever. His plan to eliminate his rival, Morris, had succeeded, but instead of delivering Deanne back into Gabby's arms, Deanne wanted nothing to do with Gabby. And despite his alibi, Deanne kept telling police that she believed Gabby must have been involved in Morris's murder. And neither Deanne nor investigators seemed to take Gabby's story about him being threatened by the supposed killer all that seriously. So Gabby hatched another, even more complicated plan. And in the first hour of Christmas morning, Gabby was ready to put that plan into effect. By that time, in the first hour of Christmas morning, all the student wrestlers who had dropped by to check on Gabby and to see if he wanted to go out with them that night, the so-called wrestling posse, they had gone. But Gabby knew that one of his visitors would come back. And when that person did arrive, everything would be in place, and Gabby himself would be physically ready for what lay ahead. He had actually been preparing for this moment all evening, all by steadily drinking so much alcohol that he was sure he would hardly feel any pain from what was about to happen. When Gabby's visitor arrived at the coach's house a few minutes later, the two men talked briefly to one another, and then Gabby made his final preparations. Taking the telephone receiver off its hook, he placed it on the living room floor so that it would be easier to reach when he needed to dial 911. And then he went over the plan one more time with Morris's killer, telling him exactly where to aim so when the bullet hit Gabby in the shoulder, it would pass right through him without hitting any critical organs. Gabby was sure that once the public discovered that he himself had been the victim of attempted murder, the police and Deanne would no longer suspect him in Morris's murder. And Gabby was sure that seeing how close he had come to death would reawaken Deanne's love for him. And then, finally, Gabby maneuvered his body into place. Getting down on his hands and knees on the floor, he assumed a wrestling position known as the referee position. And when the gunman, the most brilliant high school wrestler Gabby Moore had ever coached, just stood there, maybe 7 feet away from Gabby, looking like he might refuse to go through with this after all, Gabby turned to look at him and started repeating one word over and over again. Shoot, shoot, shoot. But just as the young man raised the pistol and finally pulled the trigger, Gabby, too drunk to hold the referee position, lost his balance and started to fall to the side, exposing the area under his left armpit. And instead of the bullet passing cleanly through Gabby's shoulder, the small .22 caliber round ricocheted off one of his ribs and started tumbling through his chest cavity, literally ripping apart his lungs and his heart. It wouldn't be until he heard the news report on Christmas Day that Gabby's accomplice would realize that instead of wounding his coach as planned, the single bullet the young man had fired had actually killed his beloved mentor and friend. It would turn out that the man who killed both Morris and Gabby was Gabby's assistant wrestling coach, a 22-year-old college student named Angelo Pleasant, who went by the nickname Tuffy. Early in the summer of 1975, Tuffy had come back to Yakima to ask his former high school coach if Gabby could help him get the extra credits Tuffy needed in order to get his degree in physical education at Central Washington College in nearby Ellensburg. Gabby was more than happy to pull some strings and offer Tuffy a job as Gabby's assistant wrestling coach. Tuffy, who worshipped his former coach, was deeply upset by the obvious distress Gabby felt over the loss of Deanne. Although he wanted to help Gabby and even asked Gabby, what can I do? It wasn't until his coach threatened to fire Tuffy from his assistant coaching position, something that would mean the end of Tuffy's college career, that Tuffy finally agreed to Gabby's plan to eliminate Morris Blankenbaker as a way for Gabby to get Deanne back. Tuffy agreed to this despite Morris being one of his friends who he had known for years. And when Tuffy later refused to cooperate with Gabby's plan to have Tuffy shoot and just wound Gabby, Gabby threatened to tell police that Tuffy had murdered Morris. In a confession to police on February 28th, Tuffy described how he had felt backed into a corner with no choice but to carry out Gabby's plan. And when Tuffy left Gabby's apartment shortly after midnight on Christmas Day, he had no idea that instead of just wounding Gabby, Tuffy had accidentally killed him. Tuffy didn't even pause after firing that fatal shot. Instead, he had immediately ran out of the apartment and gone to his cousin's house to return the .22 caliber automatic pistol to her. When Tuffy's cousin, Loretta Scott, read about Gabby's death in the newspaper a few hours later, she panicked. She worried that Tuffy may have used her gun to commit these two homicides that were now obviously linked through this gun, and that gun would be traced back to her. So, on December 26, 1975, the day after Christmas, Loretta and her brother drove to the Twin Bridges over the Natchez River and threw the pistol into the water. They had no way of knowing that instead of the gun sinking to the bottom of the river, where it never would have been found, the gun landed on a small island temporarily submerged by the runoff from winter snow and rain. But 2 months later, when Loretta read that short article in the Yakima Herald-Republic reporting that a gun had been found under the bridge in the Natchez River, Loretta decided it was time to go to police and tell them everything she knew. On August 29, 1976, Angelo Tuffy Pleasant was convicted of first-degree murder in the premeditated death of Morris Blankenbaker and sentenced to life in prison. Tuffy was also convicted of second-degree murder for the unintentional death of his coach, Gabby Moore, and sentenced to an additional 20 years in prison. But despite these lengthy sentence terms, Tuffy was released from prison in 1996. On April 18, 1976, 5 months after the murder of her first husband, Morris, and 4 months after the murder of her second husband, Gabby, Deanne Blankenbaker Moore would get married for a third time. This time, the petite brunette with the big dark eyes and soft voice would choose one of the pallbearers who had helped carry Morris's casket down the church aisle at Morris's funeral service less than a half a year earlier. 7 years younger than Deanne, Deanne's new husband would go on to become a successful business person, and Deanne would go on to become a successful stockbroker. Thanks again to the late crime writer Ann Rule, whose 1996 book, Fever in the Heart, helped us to create this podcast. Other sources for this episode include contemporary newspaper articles, documentaries, official records, and magazine articles. 24-year-old Gina Allen and her brand new boyfriend, 28-year-old Brandon Day, could not believe their luck. For the past 48 hours, they had been stranded in the rugged wilderness of the San Jacinto mountain range in California when they looked down into this ravine and they saw a campsite. There was a tarp that had been strung up between two trees. And so they ran over to it hoping that the owner of this campsite would be in there and they could help them get out of these mountains. But when they got to the campsite, there wasn't anyone there. But from the looks of it, it looked like someone had been living in this site fairly recently. Underneath this makeshift roof from this tarp was a sleeping pad, there was a warm sweater, there was shoes, there was a disposable razor, some kitchen utensils, and there was a yellow backpack. Without any hesitation, Brandon and Gina, who were totally famished and they're exhausted and they're desperate, they just start rifling through the different things in camp, hoping to find some things that will help save their life, like a cell phone or a radio radio or even just a lighter or some matches or some food. And so Brandon focused on all the items that are just kind of laying out under the tarp, and Gina focused on the contents of the yellow backpack. And so Gina, she opens up this backpack and she starts pulling out all these maps that are inside. And she notices on the margins of these maps, in the white space, there is handwriting, and it's done in pen, and it looks like it's been written fairly recently. Now, at first, she didn't read any of the notes that were on these margins. She was just kind of pulling them out and stacking them on the ground next to her and continuing to rummage through this bag. But at some point, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed on the top map that was sitting on the ground next to her, there was a particular note at the top of the page that as soon as she saw it, she stopped what she was doing, she turned and looked at it. She couldn't believe what she was seeing, and in fact, she didn't want to get her hopes up, but she slowly reached over, she picked the map up, and she put it right in front of her face, and as soon as she was reading it, she just started laughing. She was so happy, she was so relieved, she yelled to Brandon to come over and look at this. And so Brandon stopped what he was doing, he turned around, and he bent down, and he looked exactly where she was looking, and when he read what she had read, he started laughing too. They were saved. There at the top of this map, there was a note that was dated the same date as the day they were there, May 8th. And so they knew whoever had written this had written it at least in the last couple of hours because it was May 8th. And so they had to be around here somewhere. And so Gina and Brandon, they stand up and they start yelling out for the owner of this camp to please come out and help them. But in their excitement, Brandon and Gina had overlooked a critical detail in this note. And it would turn out that critical detail would change their lives and the life of the man who owned this camp forever. Before Brandon and Gina ever began their doomed hike into the San Jacinto mountain range, another man, one which neither of them knew, was gearing up for a hike of his own that would take him through the San Jacinto mountain range. His name was John Donovan, and on April 19th, 2005, which was the day he would begin this journey, he was 59 years old. John had absolutely no family. He was born an only child, and by the time he was 10 years old, he had been orphaned and basically had to raise himself from that point onward. By the time John was in his 20s, he had moved to Virginia, where he had taken a job as a social worker. And despite making a fairly decent salary, he refused to spend any more money than he absolutely had to. It was a habit he had developed as an orphan child, trying to make ends meet with virtually no money whatsoever, and as an adult, that habit just never left him. So as a result, for his entire life, all the way up until he left for that hike in 2005, he never had anything nice. He basically wore the exact same outfit virtually every single day. He never owned a car, he never owned a phone, he never owned a computer, and when it came to where he chose to live, he would always live in the most absurdly cheap dwellings possible, which included at one point living in a partially burned down, abandoned savings bank with no heat. John was a proud Irish Catholic, he drank lots of whiskey, he swore like a sailor, and he had no problem speaking his mind no matter who he was talking to. While he was a lovely person once you got to meet him, his unorthodox lifestyle and his at times gruff exterior made it pretty difficult for him to make friends for most of his life. But when he was in his 40s, he wanted to lose some weight, and so he decided to join a hiking club. And to his surprise, the other members of this hiking club adored him. They thought he was hysterical, and he made being out on the trail so much more fun and enjoyable. And before long, all these members of this club became John's family that he never had. And so John would go on every single trip this hiking club went on, no matter what. That was the most important thing to him in his life. When it came to hiking, though, John was a bit of an anomaly. Even though he would hike sometimes over 4,000 miles in any given year, he would still routinely get lost on trails he had been on dozens and dozens of times. But despite being totally self-aware of this fatal flaw in his hiking abilities, John rarely did anything to compensate for it. For example, he didn't bring with him on most hikes a compass, which would be the first thing you would think to bring with you to stay oriented. Also, because he refused to buy a phone, he didn't have that to aid him either if he ever got lost. In fact, John rarely brought much of anything on any hike he went on, because John is what you would call a ultralight backpacker, which basically meant you would only pack the absolute bare essentials, and in John's case, sometimes less than the absolute bare essentials. And despite his friends trying repeatedly to get him to pack more equipment, so he was more prepared, he would always say, no, he knows what he's doing and everything is good. And the truth is, John always did manage to get from point A to point B on all of his hikes, some of which included extremely difficult hikes, like the time he hiked the 500-mile-long Colorado Trail, or the time he hiked the 2,175-mile-long Appalachian Trail. Now, John would tell you that was all skill, but his friends would say John was extremely lucky. He would get lost, and then at the last second he would find the trail again, or he would lose some piece of critical equipment, and then just someone on the trail would happen to walk by that had an extra set of whatever it was that John needed. And then one time when John was in Poland on a hike, he slipped on this icy embankment where earlier that day, 2 other hikers had slipped and fallen to their deaths. And John has now slipped on this same embankment. He's careening down the sides. He's flailing. He can't stop himself. And then the drawstring on his pants gets caught up in a tree, and that arrests his fall and it saves his life. And so from that point on, John would only wear those pants when he went hiking, and he called them his lucky pants. In the spring of 2005, John and one of his very close hiking friends named Ken Baker, who was roughly his age, decided they were going to hike the 2,650-mile-long Pacific Crest Trail. This trail spanned the entire west coast of the United States. It starts in Southern California, right on the border of Mexico, and it goes all the way up to the very northern end of Washington State, right on the border of Canada. It takes the average hiker, if they're going to do this entire trail in one go, about 5 months, unless there's bad weather conditions that impede them along the way. John had been excitedly planning this epically long hike for the better part of the last year. He had actually typed out 6 pages on his typewriter of this itinerary that planned out every single detail of this hike, down to how many ounces of coffee he would need at every stop along the way. John was especially excited about this particular hike because it was going to be the very first hike he would be doing after his retirement from being a social worker. And apparently John had huge plans for his retirement. He wanted to travel all over the United States. He wanted to go to Australia, to China, to Russia. He basically wanted to hike at least 6 months a year, every single year, until he was too old or too weak to continue to do so. But just a couple of days before John and Ken were supposed to fly out to California to begin the Pacific Crest Trail, Ken told John that he thought they should actually postpone the start of this trip by about 3 weeks. He said Southern California had experienced their snowiest winter in decades, and so it would make sense to wait a little bit of extra time to make sure all the snow had melted and that they didn't get caught in any sort of late snowstorm. Now, John was totally not having this. He had spent so much time thinking about this trip. He was so excited about it that he just couldn't wait any longer. And so he told Ken, I'm sorry, I'm going on the current timeline, whether I go alone or not. And so on April 19th, 2005, John made his way to his office where he was a social worker. His coworkers threw him a very small retirement party, and he literally left the office, went straight to the airport, and he flew to Southern California all alone. When he got there, he took a chance and reached out to one of his other hiking friends, a 48-year-old tool salesman named Lynn Paget, and asked him, hey, I know you live in the area. Would you be interested in coming on at least part of the Pacific Crest Trail with me? I'm going to start here in the next couple of days. And John was extremely excited when Lynn said, you know what? Sure, I'd love to come along with you. And the two of them made their way over to Campo, California, which is right on the border of Mexico, and they began their hike along the Pacific Crest Trail. But after going only about 100 miles, Lynn's feet started swelling so badly that he could not go any farther. And so from that point onward, John would be alone. The San Jacinto mountain range is the first major mountain range that the northbound Pacific Crest Trail hikers will encounter, and statistically, it's actually the most dangerous portion of the Pacific Crest Trail, as 15% of all the fatalities that occur along this huge trail occur in the San Jacinto mountain range. It's a very steep mountain with a rapid rise in elevation from the desert floor all the way up to over 10,000 feet, which means in the summer, even when it's extremely hot down around the base of this mountain, it will probably be windy and snowing at the top. John reached the base of the San Jacinto mountain range on May 2nd, and as he began his slow climb up, all of the hikers he was encountering were all talking about the same thing. There was apparently some big snowstorm that was due to hit the San Jacinto mountain range in the next couple of days, and so all of these hikers were actually evacuating the mountain to go to this little town to wait out the storm. Everyone's fear was they would get caught on Fuller Ridge when the storm hit. Fuller Ridge is towards the top of the San Jacinto mountain range, and it's probably the most dangerous part of the entire mountain range. It's basically this totally exposed, very steep section where if you lose your footing, there's nothing to stop you from tumbling down to your death. But when John heard this, he wasn't fazed at all. He was not about to evacuate because of some storm. He was just going to continue up this mountain, go over Fuller's Ridge, and carry on along the Pacific Crest Trail. And so for the rest of the day, he just continued up the mountain and eventually made camp about halfway up. He actually stopped near 2 other hikers that were also going to push through despite this storm. It was a 46-year-old nurse from Canada named Connie Davis and her son, 20-year-old Alex. And they were both very experienced high-altitude climbers, and they had all the right gear, and they were very well prepared. And so that night, after both parties had set up their camp, they struck up a friendly conversation, during which John made some dismissive comments about Connie's parenting style that really agitated her, although it didn't seem like John really noticed he had upset her. And so needless to say, the next morning, Connie and her son had packed up and were long gone by the time John was waking up. So John just got up, he looked at the sky, it was still clear, although he did see some gray clouds rolling in, so he could sense that yes, a storm really is on the way, but he decided he was still just going to continue on towards Fuller Ridge. So he put his backpack on and he began walking up the trail, and a little while later, when he was nearing Fuller Ridge, but was still several miles away, 3 very well-equipped hikers that he had not seen before came charging down the path towards him. And John stopped them and he said, "Hey, how is it up there? What's the weather like? What's Fuller Ridge like?" And they kind of looked at John and sized him up, looking up and down, and they saw that, he's got light clothes on, he's got sneakers on, he doesn't have trekking poles, he just looks totally ill-prepared for what he's walking into. And they said to him, "I don't think it's a good idea for you to continue on here. This storm is going to hit any time now, and we're not going to Fuller Ridge. We're actually turning around and leaving because of this storm, and we have all the right gear. You should really consider turning around and leaving." But these 3 hikers would say there was just no way they were going to change John's mind. He was totally dead set on carrying on to Fuller Ridge. And so the 3 men that had told him not to go eventually just said, "Okay, good luck." And they carried on down the trail, and John continued up. But despite John's earlier confidence in his plan to go to Fuller Ridge and continue through San Jacinto Mountains, when the snow actually started to fall sometime in the mid-afternoon, John started to have doubts about his plans. There was already a lot of snow on the ground where he was from previous snowstorms, and that was making it hard to see the trail as it was. And now with all this additional snow starting to dump down, he was worried it was going to totally cover up the trail and he would lose it. And since he knew he kind of had a penchant for getting lost on trails, this was a real concern. But he was still very stubborn, and so despite these second thoughts, he just continued on along. And so after a while, he got to within maybe 1 or 2 miles of Fuller Ridge when he spotted up ahead of him 2 other hikers that seemed to be going in that direction. And so he ran up to them and he yelled for them to stop. And at this point, the snow is really starting to come down and the trail is completely wiped out and he can barely see in front of him. And these 2 hikers, they stop. And so he runs up to them, and when he gets up close, he can see it's actually Connie Davis and her son Alex from the night before. And so Connie is obviously not thrilled to see John again, but when he explained that he was having a really hard time staying on the trail and, could he just tag along with them, Connie said, "You know what, that's just fine, we're happy to have you." But she explained to him she was not going up to Fuller Ridge. Instead, she was taking a more circuitous route that would bypass the ridge. It would take a lot longer, but it would be safer given the weather conditions. John assured her that that was totally fine. He would just trail along with them, and then at some point he would break off on his own and he would go up to Fuller Ridge and they could go their separate way. And so Connie, her son, and John begin walking along together. Now, Connie and Alex, they had crampons on their shoes, which are basically like metal cleats and allow you to very easily grip the snow and ice. They had trekking poles, they had all the right warm gear, and so they're easily moving along through these weather conditions. Meanwhile, John didn't have trekking poles or any high-speed equipment. He did have crampons that he tried to put onto his shoes, but because he had sneakers that were not lined up to this type of crampon, they didn't really fit right, and so it caused him to constantly stumble and fall on the ground. And so that's how it went for a while until Connie and Alex reached this critical point. It was at this creek where they needed to go down and around, which would take them away from Fuller Ridge, and if John was going to continue like he said he would up to Fuller Ridge, that would be the point where he would break off from them and go up the mountain towards this ridge. And so Connie and Alex wait at the stream. They're turned around and they're looking back down the trail at John, who's fallen way behind at this point. And as they're looking at him, they're thinking, this is going to take a long time for him to finally catch up to us. And so Connie, who really wasn't all that keen in hanging around John that much longer anyways, she figured, you know what, John has made his intentions completely clear. He said he is going up to Fuller Ridge. He is an adult. He is healthy. He can do whatever he wants. And so she yelled and waved to John and signaled that she and her son were going to go down this creek and this way to Fuller Ridge, so best of luck to you. And then Connie and Alex disappeared around the corner. Once John's hiking partners had gone, John got up to that creek and he was going to try to go up to Fuller Ridge, but by that point the snow was practically blinding. And so at this point John decided, you know what, I do need to turn around and go back down the mountain and evacuate to that town where everybody else had gone to avoid the storm. And so John turns around and starts trying to backtrack along this trail back down the mountain, but the trail is gone. The snow has completely whited it out, and there's no other hikers anywhere nearby, and even if there were, he wouldn't be able to see them. And so for several hours, while it was still light out, John did his best to navigate down the mountain, and then when the sun went down, he really had no idea where he was. And so instead of trying to stay on this trail that at this point he really didn't think he was on, he looked out away from the mountain, and way down below, he saw this big bright cluster of lights. Even through the falling snow, he could clearly see those were lights of a city. And so he decided he would use that as kind of like his North Star, and he would just continuously walk downhill towards those lights. And so for several hours, he just began walking towards these lights, narrowly avoiding huge drop-offs and climbing over boulders and avoiding trees and animals. And finally, he got to this very critical point in his journey down to these lights. He reached this area called Long Valley where he had a decision to make. He could either continue down the mountain, which would require jumping down into this ravine that once he did, he would not be able to climb back out again. It was too steep. Or he could turn around and hike way back up the mountain and go some other direction. But at this point, he had really no idea what direction was the best direction. All he knew is he needed to go down the mountain because his situation was getting worse and worse by the second. If he didn't find shelter soon, he might get hypothermia and just die out here. And so he decided he would jump down into this ravine. And so he laid on his stomach, he lowered himself down over the edge, and he dropped down into the valley below. Once he stood up, he just continued walking down the mountain, and at some point he spotted a stream that he began to follow along. And as he followed this ravine, which was taking him straight down the mountain, he noticed the ravine walls, these huge walls on either side of him, seemed to get closer and closer to him, like this ravine was kind of coming to a point. And then after a while, he noticed up ahead, the stream just kind of disappeared. And so he walked a little bit farther, and then he came to an abrupt stop. The water had disappeared because it had flown off a 100-foot cliff that he was now standing in front of. He had come to the edge of this huge waterfall, and there was absolutely no way to lower himself down over it. It was an absolute fall to the death if he attempted to go down this waterfall. And so he looked to his left and he looked to his right, and these huge canyon walls that had followed him all the way to this edge from when he dropped down, they were sheer cliffs. There was no way to climb those, and his initial drop into this ravine was unclimbable. He knew that going in. And so he was boxed in, he was trapped, and he likely knew that it would be at least a week or more before anybody figured out that he was even missing. And so totally disheartened, John left the edge of this cliff, this waterfall, and walked back up to a relatively flat area farther up the ravine, and he began to set up camp. He pulled out his green tarp, he put some line between two trees, he made a makeshift roof, he laid out his bed mat underneath, and then he climbed underneath the tarp and he settled in for a long night. The next morning, when the sun came up, John attempted to make a fire, but none of the wood he was finding was dry enough, so all of his fires just kind of smoldered but didn't really catch. He had a mirror, a signal mirror, and he was prepared to flag down any aircraft that flew overhead, but no aircraft did, so he didn't flag anyone down. And so by the end of that night, he was back under his tarp, having made no progress, settling in for another freezing cold, sleepless night. The next morning, when the sun finally came up again, John was totally disheartened, and he decided to start jotting notes down on the margins of his map, which was the only place he had space to write. He figured he would keep a sort of diary. That way, if he didn't get out of here, someone would figure out what happened to him. And so his first entry was that day, May 5th, and he wrote that his friend Ken was right. He should have postponed this trip by 3 weeks and avoided the bad weather. Ken was the smart one. And also in this May 5th entry, he took an inventory of his food supply. He said he only had 12 cheese crackers left. And then on May 8th, John wrote a note that said, "Took a fall, too weak to climb out of canyon, down is a gorge, no way out." This was the message that Gina and Brandon discovered when they stumbled on this campsite. But the significance of this note was not literally what he wrote, but rather when he wrote it. On May 6th, Brandon Day and his girlfriend, Gina Allen, were in Palm Springs for a business convention. Brandon was a financial advisor, and so he was out here for business, and Gina was his guest, so she was really just vacationing. And so towards the end of the convention, when Brandon had some free time, he and Gina decided to leave the hotel and go on a hike somewhere. And so they actually linked up with a tour group that was leaving the hotel, that was heading over to this tram station where they were going to take a tram car all the way up to the top of the San Jacinto mountain range. A tram car is basically like a ski lift, except once you ride it to the top of the mountain, you don't do any skiing, you just do sightseeing. And so Brandon and Gina, they get to this tram car, they hop inside, they get to the top, and it's totally amazing, beautiful view, there's snow at the top, and they're told they have about 20 or 30 minutes before their group is going to take the tram car back down again. And so Brandon and Gina decide to kind of venture off away from the main group and have some alone time before they leave again. And as they kind of venture off, they start to hear what sounds like a waterfall. And so the two of them are kind of looking around, asking if they can see it or if they know where it is, and they don't. And so they say, "Hey, do you want to just leave the trail and walk towards this waterfall? It can't be far. It sounds like it's only maybe a couple of minutes away. We'll take some pictures, we'll come back, and then we'll catch the tram back down again." And so they decide this is a great idea. They leave the path and they start walking towards the sound of this waterfall. But after walking for a pretty significant distance, they realize the sound of this waterfall is not getting any closer. It seems to actually just be getting farther and farther away. And what they didn't know was happening was the sound of the waterfall was actually echoing off the walls of this mountain. It was basically playing a trick on them. The acoustics made it seem like it was really close, but really it wasn't. It was pretty far away. And so by the time they finally did locate this waterfall, they knew they had ventured fairly far off the main trail, and they really needed to hustle to get back up to the tram station to meet their group and catch that last car out. And so they took a couple of pictures of this waterfall and then quickly turned around and began booking it back towards the station. But on their return trip, which they believed they were going in the right direction, they started hearing the sound of voices coming from the tram station, but they were coming from a different direction. And so Gina and Brandon stopped and they're thinking, I think we got to go this way, but clearly that's the sound of the other people in our group coming from that direction. And so they decide to follow the sound of the voices. But just like the sound of the waterfall, the sound of the voices were not coming from that direction. That was just an echo bouncing off the walls. It was basically a trick the mountain was playing on Brandon and Gina. So they start walking in the wrong direction, and after walking for quite a while and not getting anywhere nearer the tram station, the voices just finally stop. And they look at their watches and they realize they missed the cutoff. They missed the last tram. All those tourists they were with, they've left. They are now alone somewhere out in the middle of the mountains. But they did not panic. They figured, what? We'll just make our way to the tram station and we'll either catch the next tram or, maybe there's a payphone or something up there we can use and, we'll figure it out. Now, it's important to mention that Brandon and Gina did not expect to spend very much time out in the elements. They expected to get on a tram, stay at the top of this tram station with a bunch of other tourists where there was a restaurant and a bar, and then they were going to ride that tram car back down and be back at their hotel before dinner time. As such, they didn't bring any supplies. They didn't even have their cell phones. They had left those in the hotel room because they wanted to make sure they were focused on each other. And so all they had were the clothes on their back, which were very light. They had tank tops and some sweatpants on. They each had a very light jacket as well. And they had a wallet and some chapstick. They had no water. They had no food. And so Brandon and Gina, they begin walking around in search of this tram station. And for several hours, despite their best efforts, they don't find it. And then before long, the sun is going down and the temperature is dropping rapidly. And so eventually, after it becomes too dark to continue to move around, the couple winds up going into a cave where they huddle up all night, barely avoiding becoming hypothermic. The next day, when the sun comes up, they haven't slept at all, they climb out of their cave, and they continue walking around the mountain in hopes they find this tram station. But eventually, they get to one of the higher points of the area they were in, and they have a pretty good vantage point around them, and when they start looking out, they don't see the tram station, they don't see anything but wilderness in all directions. And so they decided their best bet was just to walk straight down the mountain and try to just walk off the mountain. And they figured as they began walking down the mountain that the tour guide had probably recognized they were short 2 people the day before, and so certainly a search had been launched and there were people looking for them, and probably they would be found long before they ever had to actually walk off this mountain. But little did they know, their tour guide that had brought them onto the tram and then brought that group down, they had recognized they were short 2 people, but they assumed those 2 people must have just taken an earlier tram, and so nothing was reported. Nobody was looking for them. And so all day, Brandon and Gina made their way down this very steep mountain, falling half the time, smashing into rocks and trees, and getting cut up on manzanita bushes. It was just this awful experience. And by the time the sun was going down, they had no sense of how close they were to the bottom. They didn't have a good viewpoint. They were just kind of trapped inside of the wilderness. And so once again, they huddled up for the entire night. This time they didn't have a cave to protect them from the wind. And so it was just another absolutely miserable night. And so finally the sun comes up on the 3rd day, and Brandon and Gina, they're up and they are moving straight down this hill. They want to get out of there as soon as they can. And after smashing into more boulders and more trees and getting more banged up, they finally arrive at the same drop-off down into a ravine in Long Valley that John had gotten to. And so they're standing over this ravine, debating whether they should make the leap and jump down into this ravine, even though it means they can't climb out again. And so they're looking around, they're figuring, you know what, we don't really have a better choice. We don't really have the energy to climb all the way up and try to go a different way. And we don't even know if those ways are more advantageous. And so just like John, they turn around onto their stomachs, they grip the top of this drop-off, and then slip down into the ravine. Once they stand back up, they start walking down this ravine, and they spot a river. And they run over to the river, and they drink as much water as they possibly can, and it's a huge morale booster. And then they get back up again, and they're continuing walking down the stream, when off in the distance, they notice a green tarp strung up between trees. It was John's campsite. And so Brandon and Gina, they run over to this campsite, and they eventually come across John's notes on the margins of his maps. But after standing up and yelling out for this owner to please come out here and help us, we need your help, we're lost, and then no one came out of the woods, no one heard them, no one responded, Brandon went back to the note and he looked at it again, and that's when he noticed it. The note had been written on May 8th. However, it had been written on May 8th, 2005. The year that Brandon and Gina were reading it was 2006. So this note was 1 year old. John had just happened to get lost and write a note on the exact same calendar day that Gina and Brandon arrived at his campsite and discovered the note. In their initial excitement and joy that they might get saved, they did not pick up on that year discrepancy. The couple began looking more closely at all of the gear underneath the tarp, and they noticed all of the metal objects like the forks and spoons and the pots and the pans, they were all starting to rust, And some of the other objects, like the shoes, looked like they had been sitting in the same spot for a really long time. They both started to get a really bad feeling about this campsite, like something terrible had happened there. Gina emptied the yellow backpack's contents onto the ground, and that's when they found a wallet. They opened it up and they pulled out an ID card, and it was John Donovan's ID card. So now they knew who had written the note and who owned this camp. Afterwards, Gina and Brandon laid out all of the maps to see if there were other messages that they had not read yet. And there were 2 other additional messages after the May 8th message. On May 11th, John said he was celebrating his 60th birthday and that unfortunately he was down to his last 2 cheese crackers. And then in his final message on May 14th, John wrote, "Headed down to creek for water. Goodbye. Love you all." Devastated, the couple knew what they were reading were almost certainly John's last words, and his body was most likely somewhere around here. And then it dawned on the couple that if John, who seemed like an experienced hiker who had all this gear, if he had gotten trapped and died out here, then how did they stand any chance with no experience and no equipment? And so, not knowing what else to do, Gina just rounded up all of John's things. She stuffed them into his yellow backpack, and then she shouldered the pack, and then she and Brandon just walked away from John's campsite and continued walking downhill, hoping that up ahead there was not going to be some gorge like John had mentioned in his May 8th note. But unfortunately, after walking for a little while, they reached that cliff with the 100-foot drop, with the waterfall going off the side of it, and they realized that they were trapped, same as John. There was nothing they could do. And so, totally speechless and shocked, they just both sat down. They didn't look at each other, and they just sat there wondering what was going to happen next. And they both were thinking, this could be the place where I die. At some point, Gina kind of snapped out of her trance, and she took John's backpack and she began rifling through it, pulling everything out all over again. And Brandon asked her, what are you doing? And she said, well, maybe there's something in here that we missed. Maybe there's a secret pocket or something in here that could help us. And so she rifles through this bag, and sure enough, she finds inside of a small pocket in the bottom of the bag was another bag, a little plastic bag, and inside of it were matches, and they were still dry. And so immediately the couple pull them out and they start to round up logs to try to make a fire. And as soon as they light it, it doesn't catch because all the logs in the area that were on the ground were wet from previous snowstorms and rainstorms. And so all night they tried lighting these fires, but they all just kind of smoldered out. And so eventually, after the sun went down, Gina and Brandon, who were totally disheartened, they went back up to John's campsite and they went under his tarp and they huddled together for another freezing cold night. The next morning, Brandon woke up because he actually did fall asleep, and Gina was still sleeping. And so Brandon decided to just leave the tarp and go out and get a breath of fresh air. He knew they were in a terrible position, but he just wanted to clear his head. So he stood up and he could barely stand. He was so achy and tired, and he was so hungry, and he decided he would just walk down to the edge of this cliff and look out into the valley to see if maybe there was a way down. And so he walked along the river, stopping periodically to get a sip of water until he got to the very edge. And when he got there, he looked down and he saw something that he had not seen the day before. There, in a pool of water all the way down, 100 feet down, was a body lying face down in a pool of water. And that body belonged to John Donovan. Brandon was too far away to actually confirm if that really was John, but he instantly knew. But instead of being scared or saddened or depressed by the sight, it kind of invigorated Brandon and reminded him that if he doesn't act, he and Gina were going to die too. And so Brandon decided he wasn't going to set some small campfire to try to signal someone. He was going to try to light the entire forest on fire. And so he walked back up to the campsite and he got the matches out from the backpack, and then he walked into the forest a ways that was right near the river and near their campsite, and he found this tree that was obviously dead, and he walked around gathering as much dry wood as he could, and he propped it up against this dead tree, and then he put as much kindling as he possibly could into this hole in the trunk of this dead tree. And after doing all this prep work, he got his matches out and he lit some of the kindling, and to his surprise, the tree caught on fire almost immediately. In fact, it burned so quickly and so big that Brandon had to run away so that he didn't catch on fire. And before long, all these trees are catching on fire, and he had to run all the way back to the campsite and wake Gina up. And so he grabs Gina, they get up, and they run all the way over to the edge of the waterfall, and they turn, and they're just watching half an acre just completely erupt in flames. And all this black smoke is billowing up into the sky. And then about an hour later, after the fire had eventually just kind of died out on its own, Gina and Brandon heard the distant rumblings of a helicopter. They had seen the smoke and they were coming to rescue them. Gina and Brandon would be airlifted out of the ravine and would make full recoveries. John Donovan's body would be recovered 3 weeks later. His cause of death could not be determined. Some say that final note he left on May 14th, where he said he was going down to the creek to get water and then said goodbye, I love you all, that was sort of a suicide note, that he actually threw himself off that cliff to end his suffering. Others say he just walked down to the edge of this waterfall and was trying to get a drink of water from the creek when he slipped and then fell over the edge to his death. But we'll never know for sure. What we do know for sure is that in 2005, when John Donovan was still alive and missing, had he been rescued, he would have left the valley with all of his supplies, including those matches, which would have meant in 2006, when Brandon and Gina found themselves in that ravine, there wouldn't have been a way to start that fire, and so they would have died. In fact, the helicopter pilot that did come up and rescue Brandon and Gina, he would say there was nobody planning to search that area. This was not an area they believed Brandon and Gina would be. And so it really was only because of that fire that those two lived. As such, the couple said they owe their lives entirely to John Donovan and his unbelievable sacrifice. On July 11th, 2006, a funeral was held for John in Virginia. 80 people showed up for it. Most of them were his hiking friends from his club. After the service was over, they all kind of poured out onto the cemetery lawn around John's gravesite. And as the bagpipes played Amazing Grace, Lynn Paget, the man who had done the first 100 miles of the Pacific Crest Trail with John before his feet swelled up and he had to leave, he walked around the crowd handing out red Solo cups filled with a tiny bit of John's favorite whiskey. And then after making sure all of the adults had their drinks, Lynn went to the head of his very good friend's grave and he delivered a beautiful eulogy. In it, he tells the crowd that he thinks of John all the time, he misses him terribly, and at night he has the same dream. He's walking down this trail next to a stream, and then the stream bends off to the side, and as soon as he walks around the bend, he sees this green tarp. And he knows it's going to be John, and so he yells, hey comrade, hey comrade. And as he's walking over to the tarp, he realizes John isn't there. All it is a tarp, a pack, and some shoes on a rock. As for Brandon and Gina, they did stay a couple after the ordeal, but they would ultimately break up 2 years later. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the
glass dissolve in my hand and waited for the part where I understand, but nothing broke and nothing stayed. Come another morning, I'll be raised.
top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please sneak into the like button's house and warm up both sides of their pillow before they go to sleep. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts